You're listening to MRP, the Metal Robot Podcast.
In this episode, we're going back to the early days of Killswitch Engage. Back in 01 and 02, Killswitch Engage was still a bit of a fresh band on the scene, and they had also recently, at this time, been picked up by a record label, which was a big deal. It was a cool thing back in the day to be picked up by a record label before everyone had the realizations of selling souls, money, rights, freedoms, and possibly even your baby to record labels when they hit like a ton of bricks attached to your baby. So with this newfound deal, though, they gave some inspiration to give the band their all for their upcoming sophomore release, Alive or Just Breathing. And that is the album we're going to be focusing on in this episode tonight, suggested on Facebook by Kate Stevens. The album, upon release, did pretty well for itself, having sold upwards of 114,000 copies by the time End of Heartache released in 2004. So now we have the question before us for this album. Is this an essential metal album for the average metalhead? Is this essential even for Killswitch Engage fans to dig up at some point? And what was the impact of this album's release on the metal scene as a whole? Yes, really. Let's dive first into the music of this album. If you've heard Killswitch's music before, you've probably already heard this sound. Alive or Just Breathing is arguably the point where in the band's career where their sound kind of came into being and then was built upon by the End of Heartache and As Daylight Dies and so on and so forth. This is an early 2000s metalcore album. There's no way around that. It's actually showing a lot more of where metalcore was at the time, very early on, when bands started to include more melody and more mainstream appeal while also still holding on to those hardcore punk roots that were established earlier on in the last decade. And that's easy to spot with this album on the songs, the opening of Numbered Days, the chugging riffs of My Last Serenade, and even the melodic chorus of The Element of One. Basically, everything you love about Killswitch Engage started to make itself known here in a way that arguably their debut just couldn't do, which is very important in terms of the timeline of the band and their subsequent albums to follow. Now, it's not a perfect album, not by a long shot. While the future of the band's sound do have to give thanks to this album's existence, the band is still trying to find its stride in this new voice. Here's how not Killswitch Engage this Killswitch Engage album is, really. Adam D., the lead guitarist for the band, arguably one of the biggest proponents of Killswitch Engage's sound today, was the drummer. He was the drummer. They used to be a 4-piece when they were writing this album. They had to become a 5 after it was done. I don't even know how to process that fact. But even then, Jesse Leach at the time he was good behind the mic, don't get me wrong, but he was not quite there yet. His screams and growls were good, but they were clearly rough around the edges, and his clean singing, they lacked confidence in some parts, especially compared to what they would become a decade later. He was not quite there yet. And also, a big thing that some others will point out, he is not Howard Jones. I'm only really mentioning that because I can feel the Howard Jones fans creeping their way into the comments right now for not mentioning Senpai's name in the first 5 seconds of the piece. You happy now, guys? I brought him up. You can go back down to the shadows. Shut the fuck up. All that aside, though, this was still a great Killswitch Engage album. Not only did this show promise for the band very early on, it laid the groundwork for that Killswitch sound that we'd be getting all time forward. So, is this an essential album for metal? For metalheads in general? Maybe. But for Killswitch especially, for Killswitch fans, yes, it's rough around the edges, but it does mark the starting point for when the band truly started to get their sound. Now, if that's all you needed to know about this album, we can stop here. We don't need to keep going down this particular road. It's essential at least once, especially if you are a Killswitch Engage fan. We don't need to go any further. That being said, I'd like to take us on a bit of a detour down why did I go down this particular line of questioning and waste a few hours on a one-off thought that led absolutely butt-fucking nowhere avenue, because during the research for this review, looking into the background of this particular album, Alive or Just Breathing, I found a quote from a review that had me convinced that the level of importance for this album was beyond the history of the band's sound, of Killswitch Engage's sound, but was also massively important for the existence of mid-2000s metalcore and indirectly the existence of modern metal in its current form. The quote comes from Eric Thomas of MetalReview.com. Now, Eric claims that, quote, "While this album certainly is responsible for the vast amount of saturation, it stands as a pretty trend-setting, stellar must-own example of metalcore before its descent into mediocrity." Howard Jones fans, this review was written in 2005 after the end of Heartache. Enjoy. Now, that quote coming out nearly 4 years after the release of this particular album, Alive or Just Breathing, claims that it was responsible for the amount of metalcore that was coming out in that period. And if that is true, this album is most likely responsible as well for the rise of metalcore in the mid-2000s and onward, indirectly responsible for the metalcore that we have today, including many of the tendencies that we associate with, as well, modern metal. Now, you, rightfully, might be hearing all this going, "Tom, what the fuck are you talking about?" And I know, I sound like I smoked a bowl of History Channel for flat earthers. I'm fully aware of this, but stick with me for just a moment, because this theory might actually have some water that it can float upon. The first point in favor comes down to the metalcore bands that followed this album. Now, while the metalcore genre did not start in the early 2000s with Killswitch Engage, most likely dating back to 1991's Integrity and their album Those Who Fear Tomorrow, and hardcore punk before that, Baroque before that, Bashing Rocks on the Cave before that, the sound and style of Killswitch Engage, though, was that they were doing had found their traits replicated elsewhere in other bands that came out afterwards. Of course, in the mid-2000s, you had bands like Trivium, All That Remains, As I Lay Dying, Bullet for My Valentine. They started to pop up with some of these traits, as mentioned, from the early 2000s sound of Alive or Just Breathing. Yet it keeps going as well. Late 2000s rolls around, and this comes with the rise of bands like A Day to Remember, Devil Wears Prada, Asking Alexandria, Motionless in White, Under Oath, and so many others. It also marks the start of deathcore, the genre that's hated by metalcore, death metal, and even deathcore. It's a great bundle of fun. That saw Whitechapel, Early Bring Me the Horizon, Suicide Silence, Carnifex, Thy Art Is Murder, and many other prominent bands that were making this heavier and more extreme version of this of the metalcore that was around at the time. And as the next decade comes around, the sound changes again and becomes a bit more electronic, a bit more digital sounding. Architects, Spirit Box, Bad Omens, Polaris, Fit for a King, and even Jared Dines was coming out around this time too. Like, can you imagine what he'd be doing if metalcore did not exist? Seriously, that is such a weird thing to think about. I mean, he'd probably still be doing something like this in some form, but what about the gents? What about the 18 strings? Where would they be? I would assume someone's fence post, but that's such a waste of potential. Give that fence post some fucking strings. And while the later day metalcore genre is a bit harder to nail down in terms of its influences to the early days of metalcore, it's a bit more difficult to make that proper connection in full. It could be said that they would also not exist if it were not for that early days of metalcore getting the ball rolling, which brings us back to Alive or Just Breathing. It came out basically at the perfect time in metal history to have started the train of melodic metalcore to influence where it went as the decade went onward. It just kept going to where we are today. That means that this Killswitch Engage album, not The End of Heartache, not even Alive or As Daylight Dies, Alive or Just Breathing, in fact, was probably significantly responsible for the rise and shaping of modern metalcore and the entire metalcore scene. And many of the traits found themselves in a lot of modern metal as well, which is a big deal. I mean, yes, it also does mean that it may have been responsible for the existence of Emmure, Attila, and Suicide Silence again, but I try to think on the positive side here. We are, in fact, in 2020 Part 4. We gotta think positively, guys. That would make this album not just essential for Killswitch Engage fans, but for every metalcore fan out there and beyond to listen to this album at least once, so that they can hear where the entire melodic metalcore scene began and influenced many of their favorite bands. What a great place to end this segment, I thought, wrapped up in a bow with a fun theory and with hours of research and investigation spent wisely. It's been spent very, very wisely. Now, let us, you and me in the present, watch it all fall apart, because once you consider the evidence further, holes start to make themselves. Let's start with the less obvious one. We don't know what the mid-2000s metalcore bands were actually listening to. We know their influences, but they tend to starkly contrast this particular album, and in many ways, that's influences not actually what they were listening to in that moment. Take Trivium, for example. While it is possible they could have been listening to this album while they were writing and recording Ember to Inferno and even Ascendancy, the timeline does support that possibility. We know for a fact that their influences are Metallica and Pantera. Matt Heafy has gone on about this multiple times. And notably, Metallica and Pantera, not Killswitch Engage. So, strike one. But even if you want to get in something more definitive in terms of this evidence against this theory, look no further than the humble timeline, because Killswitch Engage was not the only melodic metalcore band around at that particular time. Bands around that time, they range from Atreyu's in their album The Curse to Avenged Sevenfold, sounding the Seventh Trumpet. They were not unknowns at that time. And there is one more album to consider that blows the whole thing up. Let me introduce you to the lovely woman named Jane Doe. I shoved my pasty white face so far down the rabbit hole, I forgot about the godfathers of melodic metalcore. That pokes the biggest hole in this entire theory. I mean, it's well known at this point, this particular album, Converge's Jane Doe. It was cited as a major influence by Misery Signals and Norma Jean, big prominent metalcore bands. This is canon. And yet, after all that, I think this theory still might have a bit of ground to stand on, because here's the thing. It's never just one album that influences the entirety of a subgenre. It's always a collection of them, and while we don't have enough evidence to confirm if Alive or Just Breathing inspired the entire genre, there also isn't enough evidence to completely discount it. There's, if anything, more than enough influence to show that their impact is far spread. Look, we could do an entire episode on the complexities and musical evolution and complexities of musical evolution and how subgenres come about. Believe me, we could. It would be multiple episodes, in fact. It'll probably take a lot of research and a lot of investigating and a lot of time to do. But if there's anything this episode has proven today, I'm not opposed to spending hours researching for an answer to a question nobody was even asking. The fact is, whether we're talking about Alive or Just Breathing, Jane Doe, Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, The Curse, or really any other early 2000s metalcore album, each one probably had varying levels of impact and evolution on a varying level of metalcore bands over the years. And yes, eventually causing a bit of saturation in the genre of metalcore. And I think for that alone, though, this album is indeed an essential album. Maybe not as essential as we thought it was going to be when we started down this rabbit hole. Yet remember how we started this whole thing? Fun times. It's great early metalcore still, a great foundation for Killswitch, and inspirational for the genre going forward, even if it wasn't the only one embarking on this particular quest.
You just listened to MRP, the Metal Robot Podcast.